A procedural vote on moving forward with the debate on the bill is expected today at about 2:15 Eastern. Now live to the U.S. Senate floor here on C-SPAN 2.
The Senate will come to order. Today's opening prayer will be offered by Reverend Elizabeth Evans Hagan, Senior Pastor of Washington Plaza Baptist Church in Reston, Virginia.
Let us pray. Gracious God, we thank you for being the source of all life, wisdom, and grace in this world. And truly, as your people, we are so very blessed. We are blessed with breath as we rose to this new day. We are blessed with communities and friends and family that support us. We are blessed with hope that gives our gifts and talents opportunities to be channeled into meaningful work. Help all of us, O God, as we begin this new day to remember the richness of our blessings so that we may work together courageously for all whom you have given us to serve. To whom much is given, much is also expected. May we give more today into your holy work than we gave yesterday. It is in thanksgiving that we pray in your most holy name. Amen.
Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The clerk will read a communication to the Senate.
Washington, D.C., July 19, 2012. To the Senate. Under the provisions of Rule 1, Paragraph 3 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, I hereby appoint the Honorable Tom Udall, a senator from the state of New Mexico, to perform the duties of the chair. Signed, Daniel K. Inouye, President pro tempore.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
I move to proceed to calendar number 442.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 442, S3364, a bill to provide an incentive for businesses to bring jobs back to America.
Mr. President, the first hour today will be divided and controlled between the two leaders. It will be divided equally. The Republicans will control the first half, the majority the final half. At 2:15, there will be a cloture vote on the motion to proceed to the Bring Jobs Home Act that I just moved to. Mr. President, I'm fairly confident S3401 is at the desk and due for a second reading.
The clerk will read the title of the bill for the second time.
S3401, a bill to amend the Internal Revenue Code of 1986 to temporarily extend tax relief provisions enacted in 2001 and 2003, and so forth.
Mr. President, I would object to any further proceedings with regard to this bill.
Objection is heard. The bill will be placed on the calendar.
Mr. President, over the last decade, American companies outsourced about 2.5 million jobs, often to countries where they can hire workers for half the price. And 21 million Americans, including nearly 7 million manufacturing workers, live with the fear that their jobs could be shipped overseas tomorrow. More than 130,000 of those at-risk workers live in Nevada. In the presiding officer's home state of New Mexico, more than 100,000 jobs in manufacturing, sales, management, the financial sector, and other industries are in jeopardy. And more than 300,000 jobs in the state of Kentucky, the state of my Republican counterpart, are also at risk. So I was surprised yesterday when the minority leader dismissed efforts to end taxpayer incentives for companies that outsource jobs overseas. Quote, he said, "Why aren't we doing anything?" Continued quote, "It's time to bring up serious legislation that affects the future of the country." Close quote. At a time when millions of Americans are looking for work, I'm not sure what could be more serious in protecting good-paying, middle-class jobs. The Bring Jobs Home Act, the measure before this body, would end tax incentives for corporations that ship jobs overseas. Every time an American company closes a factory or a call center in America and moves operations to another country, Mr. President, taxpayers pick up part of that moving bill. Hard to comprehend, but it's true. The legislation before this body would end that senseless series of tax breaks for outsourcers. And it would offer a 20% tax credit to help with the cost of moving production back to the United States. In just the last few years, major manufacturers like Ford, Caterpillar brought jobs back to the United States from Japan, Mexico, and China. And smaller manufacturers like Masterlock have moved facilities home as well. Congress must do everything in its power to encourage this trend. But let me remind the entire Senate. The Senate must break a record-breaking filibuster again, a Republican filibuster, before it can even begin debating the Bring Jobs Home Act. This obstruction tactic is unfortunate, but it's not surprising. After all, Republicans' nominee for president made a fortune working for a company that shipped jobs overseas. Yesterday, my friend Senator McConnell said he wants to debate serious legislation. If that's the case, he should urge his Republican colleagues to drop their filibuster. The Bring Jobs Home Act is a common-sense strategy to protect American workers. To 21 million Americans whose jobs could be the next one sent to China or India, it's a very, very serious proposal. And to the 2.5 million Americans whose jobs have already been offshored, it doesn't get any more serious than this. The only ones who aren't taking this legislation seriously are the Republicans in Congress.
Mr. President,
The Republican leader.
could I just ask the Majority Leader one question related to the vote we're going to have later today? A number of my members are asking in connection with voting to proceed to the bill whether the bill will be open for amendments.
The only amendments that I have seen are 3 in number that the Republicans have suggested: to do away with the Affordable Care Act, to reestablish the Bush tax cuts, and then the Hatch tax measure. That, Mr. President, as has been the tradition here with Republicans, has absolutely nothing to do with outsourcing. So unless Republicans get serious about legislating on the legislation we have, the answer would be very doubtful.
Well, I would just say to my Republican colleagues, apparently the bill will not be open for amendment, and we'll take that into consideration in deciding whether or not to support cloture on the motion to proceed. Mr. President, earlier this week, Senate Democratic leaders made clear to the American people where their priorities lie. And in case you're wondering, the middle class came in pretty low on the list. At a moment when more Americans are signing up for disability than finding jobs. Listen to that, Mr. President. More Americans are signing up for disability than are finding jobs. That's where the American economy stands today. Democrats said they think it's a good idea to drive the country off what economists are calling America's fiscal cliff this coming January. You might call this Thelma and Louise economics, right off the cliff. But whatever you want to call it, Democrats are evidently so determined to raise taxes on America's job creators that if we don't let them do it, they'd actually welcome an economic calamity that would rock not only the American economy, but the global economy as well. They want to drive us right off the cliff, Mr. President, threaten our own economy and the global economy as well. Needless to say, this isn't a program for jobs or economic growth. It's an ideological crusade. An ideological crusade. Following the President's lead, Democrats are declaring ideological warfare. And the banner they're marching under is emblazoned with a single word: fairness. Fairness. Here's the problem. Fairness turns out to be a lot like hope and change. Fairness turns out to be a lot like hope and change. You don't know what it means until it's put into practice. But one thing history, common sense, and basic economics tell us is that it doesn't mean what the Democrats say it does. Because when they say tax the rich, you can be sure the middle class isn't far behind. Just ask yourself, when was the last time a government program stuck to its original mission? When was the last time? Federal income taxes initially were only supposed to apply to those with taxable incomes above $500,000 a year, equal to about $11.3 million in today's dollars. And even then, the top rate was only 7%. Today, the federal income tax starts to pinch as soon as you earn $1 more than $9,750. The Social Security tax started out at 2%. What's more, Americans were told it would never rise above 6%. Yet today, the Social Security tax stands at 12.4%. And all other things being equal, it would likely have to rise above 20% to keep the program solvent. That's the condition of Social Security today. The alternative minimum tax was designed to hit 155 households back in 1969. 155 households. Today, it threatens to hit nearly 30 million households at the end of this year. Obamacare was supposed to tax the rich, yet now it turns out the very core of the bill includes a tax on the middle class. In my view, that particular deception turned out to be the difference between the law passing and not passing. They said, oh, it's not a tax. The Supreme Court says it is a tax. 77% of it hitting people making $120,000 a year and less. And it passed by just a single vote. Just one vote. Every single Democrat who supported it is responsible for the law itself and the middle-class tax at the heart of it. But the bottom line here is that a law we were told didn't hit the middle class does. Big time. And the same goes for the President's latest proposal to raise taxes on those earning more than $200,000 a year. It may be aimed at the top 2% now, but just like every other program that's supposedly aimed at a few, very quickly this tax will increase to apply to many. Even the senior senator from New York has said this tax hike will hit a lot of people who aren't rich. I agree with the senior senator from New York. After all, the revenue from the Democrats' tax increase will only cover 6% of next year's projected budget deficit. So who's expected to cover the rest? The middle class, of course. That's the fine print under every Democratic proposal. They say they're coming after the rich, but the middle class is always next. And America's small businesses are already on the line. That's one reason Republicans are so adamantly opposed to these proposals. Yes, it is a terrible idea to raise taxes in the middle of an economic downturn. Yes, government is already way too big. Yes, Democrats have absolutely no more intention of using this new revenue for deficit reduction than they have had in the past. Yes, the President's latest proposal wouldn't even raise enough money to fund the government for a week. And yes, we have no reason whatsoever to believe that the President wouldn't continue his crony capitalist ways, spending that money on pet projects of his political allies. But the larger point is this. Not only is all of this terrible economics, it's completely and totally unfair. The American people shouldn't be on the defense when it comes to keeping what they've earned. The President may think those who succeeded in life haven't done so on their own, but anybody who's ever turned a dream into reality knows he's totally wrong about that. They know the sacrifices they've made for their success, the hours of work they've put in, the time away from family, the constant worry about whether they'll succeed. And those who have made it know that what's really unfair is being told they have to now hand over even more than they already are to a president who's done nothing to show he knows how to spend it. So Democrats may think it's good politics to play Russian roulette with the economy. They may think it helps their radical ideological goals for the country to go off the fiscal cliff at the end of the year. They may look down on any enterprise that isn't controlled by the government. But nobody should ever attempt to pretend it's a good idea for the economy or for jobs or for middle-class Americans, because it isn't. And that's why Republicans think we should solve these problems now. That's what I've been calling for all week. It's what I and my colleagues will continue to call for until Senate Democrats realize we weren't sent here to play politics. We were sent here to serve the American people. Now, Mr. President, on another issue, it is with great sadness that I rise today to commemorate an honored Kentuckian who has fallen in service to his country. Specialist Nathaniel D. Garvin of Radcliffe, Kentucky, died on July 12, 2010, in Kandahar, Afghanistan, while in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. He was 20 years old. For his service in uniform, Specialist Garvin received several awards, medals, and decorations, including the Army Commendation Medal, the Army Good Conduct Medal, the National Defense Service Medal, the Afghanistan Campaign Medal with Bronze Service Star, the Global War on Terrorism Service Medal, the Army Service Ribbon, the Overseas Service Ribbon, the NATO Medal, the Basic Aviation Badge, and the Overseas Service Bar. Specialist Garvin had a nickname, Tater, given to him by his father, Cliff. That's because when he was born on July the 4th, 1989, he weighed a little more than 5 pounds. Wow, said Cliff to his wife, Nate's mother, Melanie. He's not much bigger than a sack of taters. The nickname stuck. Nate may have been on the small side, but he did not shy away from risk. He was the daredevil of the family, Melanie remembers. As soon as he was old enough to walk, he had no fears. As he grew, he would climb trees to the tip-top to get on top of roofs, scaring his mother, of course. One story goes to show just how tough Nate was. When he was still just in grade school, Nate's shoulder blade got dislocated, and the school nurse called his parents to come pick Nate up and take him to the doctor. They did, but somehow in the short time between picking Nate up from school and driving to the doctor's office, Nate managed to pop his own shoulder back into place. He did it showing no pain at all, says Melanie. The doctor was shocked, along with his dad and I. Nate's toughness included sticking up for his family. He grew up with 3 older brothers and a little sister. They may have at times picked on each other, but if someone outside the family ever picked on his brothers or sister, Nate would say, "I'm not afraid, let me handle it," said Melanie. He didn't care how big the other person was, and he would not back down. Nate was smart, funny, loving, and loyal. He could say something that in an instant could either make you laugh or have you laughing so hard you would be crying. Melanie remembers all that. Nate liked to fish, and he enjoyed playing video games. He was so good at them, other people didn't want to play against him. He also could take apart and put back together the video game machines or almost anything else electronic. After Nate met and married his wife Brittany, both he and one of his older brothers decided to use the buddy system and join the military at the same time, following in the footsteps of another brother, Garvin. Nate felt it would be a good way to provide not only his wife, but also his then unborn child. So Nate entered the Army in July 2008. He scored highly enough on his entrance exams to have his pick of any field he wanted. Nate chose avionics. He did his training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, and Fort Eustis, Virginia, and was assigned to B Company, 96th Aviation Support Battalion, 101st Airborne Division, based in Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Nate was able to come home from the Army for Christmas in 2008, and his timing was good. On December 26, 2008, his daughter Kaylee was born. That was the happiest day in his short life. He loved her with all he had, said Melanie. In the short time they had together, Kaylee became her daddy's little girl. Her grandmother Melanie says she looks so much like him at that age, we say she is Tater made over, just in a dress. She has his smile, and her eyes light up just like his did. She also has her daddy's stubborn streak and smartness. Nate would play video games, and Kaylee would sit beside him with an old game controller Nate gave her, pretending she was also playing the game. When Nate bobbed and weaved, she did too. Nate was deployed to Afghanistan for Operation Enduring Freedom in March 2010. As Melanie put it, Tater was due to come home for his R&R in August 2010, but unfortunately didn't make it. He lost his life one day before his mother's birthday and 2 days before his 21st. He never got to meet his son, who was born April 9th, 2010. We're thinking of Specialist Nate Carvin's loved ones as I recount his story for my colleagues today. Mr. President, that would include his wife, Brittany, his parents, Melanie and Cliff, his daughter, Kaylee Jo, his son, Wyatt Boone, his brothers, TJ, Alex, and Jeremy, his sister, Whitney, and many other beloved family members and friends. The Garvin family is also thankful for the assistance given them by Captain Eric Healy during the difficult events of 2 years ago. The loss of Specialist Nathaniel D. Garvin is tragic, and it is only appropriate that this United States Senate pause to honor his service and recognize his sacrifice. I hope that his family, particularly his 2 young children, can take some comfort from the fact that both the Commonwealth of Kentucky and this country are grateful for and honored by the heroism and courage that Nate showed, both in and out of uniform. And the example he set for his loved ones and his country will not be forgotten. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the following hour will be equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Hampshire is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent to enter into a colloquy with my colleagues.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to talk about an issue that is of deep concern to our country, one of the greatest national security threats facing our country right now. And what that is what's called sequestration. To bring that down to plain terms for the American people, our Department of Defense is facing an additional $500 billion across the board MeTAX in cuts, in addition to the already planned $487 billion in reductions over the next 10 years if we do not act as a Senate, as a Congress, and if the Commander-in-Chief does not act to come up with more responsible ways to cut spending. We all know that we have nearly a $16 trillion debt. We all know that that debt threatens our country not only as a national security threat, but also as a threat to the quality of life of my children. I'm the mother of a 7-year-old and a 4-year-old, and future generations in this country. However, what we did last August is that we did a kick-the-can exercise where we left to a super committee to come up with $1.2 trillion in savings rather than sitting down and coming up with the savings we should have at the time. So where we are left is with a MeTAX across-the-board approach instead of prioritizing our spending, and we are putting at risk the most fundamental constitutional responsibility we have to the American people, and that is to keep them safe. Daniel Webster, who is born in New Hampshire, served as a senator from Massachusetts, was a great statesman. He said in 1834, "God grants liberty only to those who love it and are always ready to guard and defend it." Well, we know from our men and women in uniform that they have been there for us to guard and defend this great nation. Not only the current men and women that serve, but generations of brave men and women have served our country. And where we are right now, we do a disservice to them not to resolve this sequestration, these across-the-board cuts, by coming up with alternative spending reductions, which we can do. And just to put it in perspective, 1 year of sequestration is about $109 billion, and that also covers the non-defense. If we can live within our means within 1 month with this government, we can come up with the spending reductions. And we need to do that on behalf of our Department of Defense and for the American people. Just some of the things that have been said about the impact of these across-the-board cuts. Our chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has said that we will face the potential for increased conflict. He also said, "We are living in the most dangerous time in my lifetime right now," meaning right now. And I think sequestration would be completely oblivious to that and counterproductive. We also know that every leader of our military from every branch has spoken to both the House Armed Services Committee, the Senate Armed Services Committee, and what they have said is shocking and should be a wake-up call to members of both sides of the aisle that we owe it to our military and to the American people to address it. Just some of the things that have been said about sequestration. The Chief of Naval Operations has said, we will do irreversible damage to our Navy. It will hollow out the military, and we will be out of balance in manpower, both military and civilian, procurement and modernization. The Chief of Staff of the Army has said it would be catastrophic to the military. And we will be put out of balance in we will reduce our capability and capacity to assure our partners abroad, to respond to crisis, and to deter our potential adversaries, and threatening our readiness. The Air Force Chief of Staff has said we will be left with a military with aging equipment, extremely stressed human resources, with less than adequate training, and ultimately declining readiness and effectiveness. And as I said yesterday on this floor, the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps has said that the Marine Corps will be unable to respond to one major conflict on behalf of this country. There are many things that we can predict. One of the things we know we can predict is what's going to happen with sequestration. We know that if we don't address our debt now, that we are facing the fate of Europe. But one thing we've been very bad at predicting is where the next conflict is coming for our country, where the next threat that faces our country comes from. And if our Marine Corps is unprepared to respond to one major contingency, our country is at risk. And that is why we need to address this. It is not only the impact on our men and women in uniform from the Chief of Staff, from the Commandant of the Marine Corps, of all the branches that have spoken, but I had the chance to participate in a panel yesterday to hear from the concerns of our enlisted about this. I heard from the former top enlisted person in the Marine Corps, Sergeant Major Kent, and he expressed deep concern that we would be breaking faith with our troops. And our military leaders have expressed real concerns that we will not only undermine our national security, but we will fail to keep faith with those who have sacrificed so much for our country and that we owe everything to. In addition to the dire national security impacts of allowing this irresponsible across-the-board approach to occur in January, we also know that there are nearly 1 million jobs at issue. And in fact, yesterday before the House Armed Services Committee, the CEOs of some of our major defense employers testified before the committee. In fact, the CEO of Lockheed Martin, Bob Stevens, has said that I've spent decades of my professional working life in the national security arena, and I've never been as concerned over the risk to the health of our industry and our government as now. He said the effects of sequestration are being felt right now throughout our industry. Every month that goes by without a solution is a month of additional uncertainty, deferred investment, lost talent, and ultimately increased cost. You see, it's not just our men and women that keep our country safe. It's those that work to make sure that they have the right equipment, that we have the best technology, that we have the best capability of gathering intelligence to prevent future attacks against our country. Our defense industrial base is incredibly important, and not to mention 1 million jobs at issue. Yesterday, Dave Hess, the president of Pratt & Whitney, said, and he's the chairman of the Aerospace Industries Association, as an industry, we're already seeing the impacts of potential sequestration budget cuts today. Companies are limiting hiring and halting investments, largely due to the uncertainty of how sequestration cuts would be applied. And a small business owner, Della Williams, because it's not just our large employers, a lot of small businesses make parts for our weapon system, for our equipment, for our military, and they can't sustain this uncertainty that we've created for them in Congress and these cuts, and many of them will be forced to go out of business. And what Della Williams said, what is being billed as a stopgap budget fix will have lasting effects on our defense capabilities for years to come. The switch will just not get flipped back on to reverse that trend. Moreover, the deep personnel and program cuts will threaten our national security. Indeed, the United States could lose our technological and strategic advantage and never get it back. And so this is why it is so important. And by the way, the defense yesterday, the CEO of Lockheed Martin felt he had to issue a memo to his employees. And in that memo that his employees will receive, he said, "We believe sequestration is the single greatest challenge facing our company and our industry." Defense Secretary Leon Panetta has said that sequestration will have catastrophic consequences for our national defense. With little guidance from the government on the specifics of sequestration, it's difficult to determine the impact of these cuts on our employees. We do know that we have a responsibility to tell you that you could potentially be laid off, and that we have a duty to issue what's called WARN Act notices to you, because under federal law, these defense employers are going to have to, 60 days before January 2nd, issue potential layoff notices to their employees. And of course, that will also create lots of uncertainty and consternation in many American families, which is unnecessary if we would come to the table right now and address this issue. We can find spending reductions that do not threaten our national security. And just to put a couple of numbers in perspective, some states just in job losses on this. Virginia, according to AIA, there was a new report issued this week done by the George Mason University. Virginia, 136,000 defense industrial-based jobs. Florida, 41,000. Pennsylvania, 39,000. My home state of New Hampshire, just on the defense end, 3,600 jobs. And so we owe it to the American people to act now. This is too important to be used as a bargaining chip in December because people want to use it to put our national security at risk because of other issues that they want addressed. We've always treated national security as a bipartisan issue in this chamber, and I would hope that we would not use our Department of Defense and put our men and women in uniform in this uncertain position. We need to let them know we have their back, and as members of Congress, we should be together right now, sitting at the table, resolving this, coming up with alternative spending reductions. And I would also call on the President, as Commander-in-Chief of this country, to lead that effort, to stop sitting on the sidelines, Mr. President. This is too important to the security of the United States of America. And with that, I see my colleague from South Dakota here today, John Thune, who is a leader in our conference and someone I know has been very focused on this issue. And Senator Thune, I would ask you, yesterday the House was focusing on this issue. We know that there were hearings before the House Armed Services Committee. In fact, the House, we should point out, through reconciliation, has already passed a bill to address sequestration to make sure that our national security is protected. And they've done that. It has not been taken up in the Senate yet, unfortunately, and the Senate, I call on the majority leader in the Senate to act now because the House has passed something. But yesterday they also held a hearing. The House passed another measure by 414-2 that's called the Sequestration Transparency Act. It's a companion bill to one that you, Senator Thune, introduced in this chamber. I know how focused you have been on this issue. And that the Senate passed a similar amendment to the Farm Bill. One of the issues we saw from the CEOs that testified yesterday from our defense industrial base is Department of Defense, OMB, they've got no guidance on where these cuts will be implemented. And so therefore, I know that yesterday the House actually passed this act to address that piece of it. And I would ask, does the senator from South Dakota agree that the Senate should immediately pass the legislation that you introduced, this bipartisan House bill that's coming over, a version so that we can know, the American people can know right away, have the agencies tell them specifically what the impacts of sequestration are. And of course, most importantly, we need to address this before the elections because we should not play political football with this. So with that, I ask the senator from South Dakota what you think we should do here in the Senate right now.
I thank the senator from New Hampshire for yielding on that point and more importantly for the great work that she's doing as a member of the Armed Services Committee, been a very active member of that committee, a strong and clear voice for New Hampshire and for America's national security interests. And I might also add we served together on the Budget Committee where really this should have originated. Unfortunately, since we didn't pass a budget, it's very hard to to have a plan for how to proceed with spending the taxpayers' money, and this is what you end up with. Now, because we have this process put in place where if action isn't taken to avoid it, we have an across-the-board sequester that would occur at the first of next year, half of which would come out of the defense budget. We need to be able to find out exactly how these cuts would be implemented. Now, the thing that we don't know is how the administration plans to implement this. And I think that's what the Transparency Act that passed in the House of Representatives yesterday is designed to get at. And by the way, it was an overwhelming vote. It was 414-2. The House of Representatives, in an overwhelming bipartisan way, weighed in on the issue about whether or not the administration ought to spell out in clear detail to the United States Congress and to the American people how it intends to implement its sequestration plan. And I might say that it's going to be very difficult for us as members of Congress to come up with an alternative replacement plan if we don't know what their plan is for implementation. We know that a half of the reductions are going to come out of defense, at least that's the plan, the other half out of non-defense discretionary spending, but it's very clear that this would have a profound impact on the defense budget on top of the $500 billion in cuts that occurred as part of the Budget Control Act last summer. But I would say to my colleague from New Hampshire, and I think she has very clearly and very well laid out the impacts as have been delineated and described by many of our service chiefs, by many of our military leaders in this country, what those impacts would be on our national security, on our readiness. Also, you've elaborated, and I think extremely well, about the economic impact, what it's going to mean in terms of jobs in our economy. But I want to just for a moment come back to this fundamental point because I think it's one that shouldn't be missed by people who are following this debate, and that is that if the Budget Committee and the Senate had done its work in the first place and passed a budget, we wouldn't be where we are today. If we had actually passed a budget, now the senator from New Hampshire this is her second year, I think, on the Budget Committee. Even before she got here, we hadn't passed a budget. I got on the Budget Committee in this last session of Congress, so it's been 2 years since I've been on the committee. But it's a committee without a purpose, without a mission. If you're not going to pass a budget, I'm not sure why you would want to have a Budget Committee. And the other thing that's really interesting about this is we're not going to pass any appropriation bills. Not only do we not pass a budget, the Appropriations Committee here in the Senate, there are 12 usually annual bills that come across the floor of the United States Senate. The Majority Leader said he's not going to bring appropriation bills to the floor. Now, the House of Representatives, I think, has passed 9 appropriation bills. They passed a budget, and the Appropriations Committee here in the Senate has been moving and passing appropriation bills out of the committee. But the leader of the United States Senate has said, we're not going to move appropriation bills this year. We didn't move a budget. We're not moving appropriation bills. And so what you end up with is a Budget Control Act like what we passed last summer that takes these draconian whacks out of the defense budget and puts America's national security interests at risk and in great peril. And so I would just ask my colleague from New Hampshire, who, as I said, is a member along with me of the Senate Budget Committee, might this situation have been avoided had the Senate done its work as it's supposed to do in an orderly way, followed the law, actually passed a budget, actually worked on getting appropriation bills on the floor of the United States Senate, might we have avoided what is before us, and that is these devastating, disastrous, and some have described as catastrophic cuts in our defense budget. It seems to me, at least, that's where you end up when you don't do your work in the first place. So my colleague from New Hampshire, I would simply ask you as a member of the Budget Committee whether or not we might be in a different situation for the fact that we hadn't passed a budget now for 3 years.
Well, I would say that my colleague from South Dakota is absolutely right. If we had done a budget for this country and the Senate Budget Committee functioned in the way it was intended to function, then we wouldn't be in this situation in the first place. When we do regular budgeting and do the responsible thing for our country, like every business does, like every family does, on the annual basis we are supposed to do it, as opposed to it's been over 3 years since we've had a budget, then we wouldn't be in this situation right now where our Department of Defense is at risk. And I know the senator from South Dakota voted for a budget that the House passed, I did as well, that had that budget been passed, then the House did its job, and had we done that, we wouldn't be here with sequestration today. And because we're doing what we owe to the American people, if we can't do a budget for this country, how are we ever going to get the trillion-dollar deficits in check? And unfortunately, we know why we don't have a budget, because the majority leader of the Senate has not shown the leadership that he should, because he said it would be foolish for us to pass a budget, has not allowed the Senate Budget Committee, which you're right, I'm not sure why we have that committee. I've been on there now for a year and a half, and we haven't marked up a budget. We haven't done it, and that's because the majority leader of the Senate has said it would be foolish for us to do a budget. Why? Because when you do a budget, you do have to make choices, just like families do, just like businesses do, and prioritize where you're going to spend the money and the taxpayer dollars that are sent to Washington by our constituents, by the American people. And that's unfortunate of where we are today, because had we done that, then I don't think that we would be in the position that we are with sequestration.
Well, I think the Budget Control Act, which passed last summer and created this process which has led us to sequestration, to where we are today, really is a function and a result, a clear outcome of not having passed a budget. And it's ironic in many respects because, as the senator from New Hampshire has pointed out, the first fundamental responsibility we have as members of Congress is to tell the American people, the taxpayers who pay the bills for this government, how we're going to spend their money. And this is now the third year in a row that the United States Senate has failed to do that. And again, I might simply add that the House of Representatives did do a budget, has been passing appropriation bills, has been following the law in accordance with what has been the practice around here, at least up until the last 3 years, of actually working on a budget. When you're borrowing 40 cents out of every dollar that you spend, it would strike me at least that it would be really important that you go through an exercise of figuring out how you're going to start whittling away at that deficit, how you're going to start getting that debt to a more manageable level, and how you're going to spend the American taxpayers' dollars. But as the senator from New Hampshire has pointed out, and again, I don't think we can emphasize this enough, because we last summer already called for $500 billion in defense cuts, and that was half of the amount of reductions that were made last summer. There was about $1 trillion, little under that overall, in spending cuts last summer, immediate spending cuts, half of which came out of defense, $487 billion already taken out of the defense budget. So what we're talking about now is another $500 billion over the next 10 years on top of that $500 billion. In other words, $1 trillion out of our national security budget. And what the Secretary of Defense, the President's own Secretary of Defense, has said is that would lead to the smallest ground force since 1940, since before World War II, the smallest fleet of ships since 1915, almost a century, and the smallest tactical fighter force, Air Force, that we've had literally in the history of the Air Force. That's what we're talking about. That's the dimension of the problem that you're referring to. And it completely impairs our ability to project power in many of these critical areas of the world. And the world is a dangerous place. It's not getting any less dangerous. It's getting clearly more dangerous if you read the headlines every single day. And our ability to project power in the Middle East, project power in Asia, all the areas of the world that we need to keep an eye on is going to be in serious jeopardy. And I want to make one observation about that, because it's something that to me I think is very important. And my state of South Dakota is home to a bomber base. But one of the key ways that our nation projects power is through the use of the bomber fleet. Our bomber fleet is aging. Nearly half of the fleet was built before the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, if you can imagine that. And so it's highly important that we modernize our bomber fleet. And Secretary Panetta has stated that development of the next generation bomber would be delayed by sequestration until well toward the middle of this century. So we're talking about dramatic reductions in ground forces, Navy, Air Force, all the assets that we use to protect this country and to defend America's interests around the world would be a great risk if this sequester goes into effect. And the number one priority, as the Senator of New Hampshire, from New Hampshire has very appropriately pointed out, the number one priority we have is to defend this country. If we don't get national security right, the rest is conversation. All the other things that we talk about are secondary to defending and protecting America and the American people. And so this is a very, very serious debate, and I would come back to the question that the Senator from New Hampshire posed in the first place, and that is that yesterday the House of Representatives passed by a 414-2 vote a piece of legislation that would at least require the administration to tell us how they intend to implement these cuts by program, project, and activity level, so that we know with some detail and specificity how these proposed cuts are going to take effect, and that would allow us at least to come up with an alternative plan and perhaps be able to replace and substitute other cuts elsewhere in the budget for what are going to be disastrous cuts in the defense budget. I have introduced companion legislation here in the Senate, very similar to what the House passed yesterday. I hope that the United States Senate will pick up the House bill and move it, pass it, so that we can get the administration at least and the President engaged in this discussion about what they intend to do in terms of implementing sequestration, and then perhaps work with us to avoid the catastrophe that we're referring to and talking about, and which has been documented and validated by all our military leadership in this country, and what would be a very, very serious and dangerous reduction in America's national security resources and in our ability to keep our country ready and able to defend America and American interests around the world. So to the Senator from New Hampshire, I appreciate so much your leadership on this issue. I hope that, I know you've been very active in trying to get the administration to provide more information with regard to what the impacts are going to be on the defense budget as a member of the Armed Services Committee. I also think that they ought to furnish all the information on these cuts, not only in the defense part, but in the non-national security part of the budget. And by the way, defense represents 20% of all federal spending, but we're going to get half of the cuts. The proportionality of this is a real issue in my view, because that happened last summer. Half of the cuts that were made last summer came out of defense, even though it only represents 20% of federal spending. And half of the cuts would come out of in this particular sequester would come out of the defense budget, even though, again, it represents only 20% of all federal spending. And so I would hope that as my colleagues here in the Senate continue to, hear from people around the country, people who are impacted by this, not only our military leadership, but also those whose jobs are going to be impacted by this, that there will be a new sense of urgency, a new intensity to try and resolve this issue. And it starts with getting the administration to, in a transparent way, disclose how they intend to implement sequestration. And so I look forward to working with my colleague from New Hampshire to make that happen, and I hope that we can get that done, and I hope that our colleagues on the other side, the Democrat leadership, will agree to moving that legislation.
I thank my colleague from South Dakota for his leadership on this issue, and I too hope that we will get that passed immediately in the Senate, that we have clarity from our Department of Defense as well as the non-defense agencies, so A, the American people can know what the real impact of this is, and also so that we can act immediately. And I can't emphasize enough that this needs to be done before the elections. We need to do it before the elections because we've already, I talked about some of the testimony from the CEOs from our defense industrial base, and there will be, unfortunately, layoff notices that will have to be issued because of responsibilities they have under federal law. And let's face it, we really shouldn't have this cloud of uncertainty and feeling for our men and women in uniform, many of whom have served multiple tours for us and defended our country so admirably and so courageously. And that's why I think this is an issue that deserves action now, should not be used as a bargaining chip for other issues. And this is an area where we've always, on a bipartisan basis, been able to, for example, I serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee. The defense authorization, we voted it out unanimously. Well, this is an issue I would hope we would be unanimous on, that we are not going to break faith with our men and women in uniform. We are not going to put our country in jeopardy. And I am hopeful that we will also see leadership. And I call upon the President again to be a leader here, to be the commander-in-chief of this country, and to call us to action to resolve this before the election. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, Mr. President, I have 5 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I ask unanimous consent that these requests be agreed to and that these requests be printed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do want to speak as chair of the Agriculture Committee about what is happening on the droughts across the country, but let me first take a moment as the author of the Bring Jobs Home Act to say that this afternoon we're going to have an opportunity to come together as we did on the Farm Bill when we came together on a bipartisan basis to focus on growing things in America and the need to strengthen our economy, provide economic certainty around agriculture and the food industry in America. And it really was a wonderful opportunity for us to get something done. This afternoon we're going to have the same kind of opportunity to come together and recommit ourselves to making things in America. And the Bring Jobs Home Act, as you know, is a very simple, straightforward way to eliminate a subsidy that should have been gone a long time ago, and that is the tax write-off for shipping jobs overseas. When someone is losing their job because their plant is closing up and going overseas, to add insult to injury, they, as a taxpayer, get to help pay the cost of moving. It's really outrageous. What we want to do is stop that. That's what the bill does. Give a business tax deduction for the cost of bringing jobs home, and then add another 20% tax deduction on top of it to encourage businesses to do that. So we'll be talking more about that later, but it is very important, and I hope that colleagues will come together and send a very strong message about America, buy America, American jobs. Let's bring those jobs home. Mr. President, I also want to talk today about the terrible weather conditions across the country. It frankly started with an early spring and then a returning frost and snow in Michigan and areas around the country that have orchards and fruit crops, and has now gone from there to an extension of a drought situation that is absolutely terrible. It's a very serious crisis around the country. Not since the days of the Dust Bowl have we seen this lethal combination of scorching heat and bone-dry weather across the production regions of our country. And as I speak, 80% of the country is suffering from abnormal dry or drought conditions. 64% is suffering from moderate or severe drought, the highest percentage in 56 years. And as you can see on the map, any area that's in colored here on the map has had some kind of a drought, with the red, the black areas being the worst, but either from abnormally dry, moderate, severe, extreme, or exceptional drought in almost every area of the country. This is extremely severe, and we need to take action to support our growers and ranchers. We have almost 1,300 counties across the country that are rated as drought disaster areas, and that's 1/3 of all the counties in the United States. And every day it seems that the Secretary of Agriculture is adding more to the list. More than 75% of the nation's corn and soybean crops are in drought-affected areas, and more than 1/3 of those crops are now rated poor to very poor. This is devastating our crops and our livestock producers. Only 1/3 of our soybean crop is considered good to excellent right now, which is down by about 30% from last year. According to the Department of Agriculture's weekly crop progress report, less than 1/3 of the nation's corn crop is in good or excellent condition. Nearly 40% is rated poor or very poor. And so we're talking about a massive effect on farmers, on livestock producers, and ultimately on consumers in America. Facing higher food and feed costs and pastures that are withering due to the heat, our ranchers and livestock producers could see significant losses. I had an opportunity a number of months ago with Senator Roberts to be in Kansas and to see what was happening then, even before all of this. And I understand how very serious this is for our livestock producers. The livestock sector could face significant declines in margins. We could see a sharp increase in consumer prices for meat and eggs and dairy. At a time when families all across America, middle-class families, are trying to still recover from the Great Recession, paying more at the grocery store is not going to help. In fact, it's going to hurt a lot. The USDA has opened up their Conservation Reserve Program so that land will be there for grazing, but we know it's not going to be enough for producers. There is no crop insurance equivalent for livestock. More producers may lose their ranches because of this drought. And livestock disaster assistance expired last year, and we need the Farm Bill to become law so that we can make this help available again. Because in the Farm Bill, we extend the livestock disaster assistance program permanently, and we make it available for this year. This drought is a serious problem, devastating all of our farmers, and will come home to families and to the world, unfortunately, all too soon. And we can't control the weather. We know that. In fact, the farming, ranching is the riskiest business in the world. And I should say, Mr. President, even though it is, we have the safest, most affordable food supply in the world, and it really is part of our national security. But we can't control the weather and the risks the farmers face. But this drought underscores the need for improved risk management tools, a better crop insurance, and it underscores the need for a farm bill. We need to get a farm bill done, now more than ever. We have 16 million people that work in this country because of agriculture and food industries, almost 1 out of 4 in Michigan. We came together, and it was a lot of work, a lot of bipartisan effort, and I'm very proud of what we did together in the Senate a couple of weeks ago to pass a farm bill. We now have the House having acted in committee and passed a strong bipartisan farm bill. It's different. There are some things certainly we need to work out in a conference committee. Our bill has more reforms in it. We certainly are concerned about the nutrition cuts, but I would say this. We need the House to pass their farm bill so we can come together in a conference committee and find the right balance that's good for families, consumers, farmers, ranchers, business people across the country. And I'm very confident that we can do that, but we need the House to act to be able to make that happen. Weather disasters are getting worse every day, and it makes it even more important that we have our legislation and that, frankly, we work together to add some pieces to it in a conference committee so that we can address what's happening. In our bill that passed, as I said, we extended a livestock disaster assistance program, made it retroactive to this year. We also included a provision that I authored for fruit commodities that don't currently have crop insurance, to allow them to be able to buy into a program that is in law, and we've actually strengthened it, made it better. But for those that don't have crop insurance, we also said that they could get help this year. So we do have some things in the bill that we passed, and we can work together to strengthen that even more. Senator Baucus, Chairman of the Finance Committee, is working, and we are working closely with him on something that would be a more comprehensive disaster assistance program. But in order to be able to do that, we have to have a farm bill. And this is not, as we know, a partisan issue, Mr. President. We came together across the aisle, consumers, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, people who vote, people who don't vote, across this country care about a safe, reliable, affordable food system, and that certainly goes for our farmers and ranchers and their families in communities all across America who are hit so hard by the drought. So let me just say as I close, Mr. President, that this drought is evidence that we need to come together and act. When we look at this kind of a weather map and what's happening, and the fact that the majority of communities in our country are facing disaster as a result of the droughts and other things that happened as it relates to the weather, we need to act. We need to act in a responsible, bipartisan manner. We can do that. We did that in the Senate. The House committee did it, and I commend them for that. We need the support and help of the leadership in the House to be able to get this to the floor and get it passed so that we can get it done. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, let me compliment Senator Stabenow for her leadership as chair of the